All right, hey everyone, welcome back. If you're listening, it means you're just as hooked on this Duterte saga as we are. And trust me, this deep dive we're about to take is going to be a wild one.
Yeah, it's definitely got more layers than an onion, that's for sure.
Well, you guys wanted to understand what all the fuss was about, so we hit the news hard. Specifically, we dug into some recent articles about former Philippine President Duterte. And let me tell you, the headlines alone are enough to make your jaw drop.
It's not your everyday political drama, that's for sure.
No, not at all. I mean, we're talking about accusations of sedition, unlawful utterances, the whole 9 yards.
And it really gets you thinking, about free speech, the power dynamics in the Philippines. Has anything really changed?
So, to set the stage, we're talking about a PDP-Laban proclamation rally that happened in San Juan on February 13th. Duterte's there, the crowd's going wild, and then boom, he drops this bombshell.
A real head-scratcher.
He says, and I'm quoting directly here from the February 18th article in the Philippines, it's titled, CID files sedition raps versus former Philippine President Duterte. He says, quote, now there are too many of them. What should we do? Let's just kill the senators now to create vacancies. If we kill 15 senators, we all get in.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
Especially with Duterte, right? I mean, this is a guy who's known for his, well, let's just say his colorful language and his even more colorful past, especially with the war on drugs.
Yeah, his tough-on-crime approach was definitely a defining feature of his presidency, But this, suggesting to kill senators, that feels like he's taking it up a notch, even for him.
It really makes you wonder, right? Like, is this just classic Duterte, trying to get a rise out of people? Or is this something more, something darker?
Well, one thing's for sure, people are not taking it lightly.
No, not at all. I mean, look at the reactions. You've got Major General Nicholas Torre III, the head of the PNP-CIDG, basically saying, hold my beer.
The PNP-CIDG, for those who don't know, that's the Philippine National Police Criminal Investigation and Detection Group.
Right, and he filed charges against Duterte, sedition and unlawful utterances. Boom.
No messing around. But why such a strong reaction? I mean, politicians say outlandish stuff all the time.
Well, I think Torres' point is that you can't just ignore this kind of talk, especially coming from someone like Duterte. This is a man who's been linked to incitement of violence before, particularly during his crackdown on drug users.
You can't really argue with that, can you? I mean, there's a history there.
Yeah, it's definitely a cause for concern. Torres is basically saying, look, words have consequences. And when you've got someone with Duterte's track record, you can't just brush it aside as, oh, he's just letting off some steam.
But not everyone's buying Torre's take on this, right?
Right, and this is where things get really interesting, because then you've got Jaime Santiago, the director of the NBI, and he's basically saying, hold up, pump the brakes.
The NBI.
The National Bureaus of Investigation. And he's essentially dismissing Duterte's words as political rhetoric. He's saying, look, this is just how they talk. It's part of the game.
So is he saying we shouldn't take it seriously?
He seems to be suggesting that those old-school tactics, that kind of fiery rhetoric that might have flown before, it's not going to cut it anymore. It's a Bergong Pilipinas now.
A new Philippines. So is he drawing a line in the sand?
It seems like it, yeah. He's saying those old ways of doing things, they're over.
So we've got Torre saying this is a big deal and Santiago waving it off. What does the law actually say about all this? Like, what even is sedition and what are unlawful utterances?
Okay, so sedition, in a nutshell, it's basically about inciting rebellion against the government. Like, you're trying to get people to overthrow the powers that bore.
So is Torre suggesting Duterte's little comment is a direct call to overthrow the Senate? That seems like a stretch.
It does make you wonder, right? Like, how strong is that argument, really? But I guess Torre might say that even if it's not a literal call to arms, it still creates an atmosphere of hostility, maybe even encourages violence against senators.
Okay, so it's more about the potential consequences, the mood it creates, rather than a literal interpretation. And what about these unlawful utterances? What's that all about?
Well, that's a little bit more broad. It basically covers any kind of speech that's deemed harmful or dangerous, like inciting panic, spreading fake news, making threats, that sort of thing.
So is Torre saying Duterte's words, even if they're not about rebellion, still fall under this broader umbrella of harmful speech?
Exactly. And this is where the whole debate gets really tricky. Because where do you draw the line? When does free speech become something that can land you in hot water?
It's a classic legal dilemma, isn't it? Courts all over the world are constantly trying to figure that one out. So we've got Torre taking it seriously, Santiago brushing it off. What about Duterte himself? What's his take on all this?
Well, his former legal counsel, Salvador Pinello, he's stepped in and he's calling the whole thing ridiculous.
Okay, but what about the comment itself?
He's actually suggesting that the current administration should be happy about it.
Wait, what? Happy about Duterte suggesting killing senators? I don't follow.
Pinello's argument is that by saying he wants to kill senators to make room for his own party's candidates, Duterte is actually showing how strong those candidates are. Like, there's such a threat that the only way to get them in is to, well, you know.
That's a pretty creative spin, I'll give him that.
It's a unique defense strategy, that's for sure.
So we've got three very different takes on this whole thing. This is already turning into a massive political and legal showdown.
And remember, we haven't even heard from the senators themselves yet.
Yeah, their reactions could be the most interesting part of this whole saga.
Definitely. We'll dive into all that in the next part of our deep dive. It's kind of wild, though, right? None of the senators have actually filed a complaint against Duterte.
So are they just ignoring it?
Well, not exactly. I mean, some lawmakers have definitely spoken out against it. They're seeing this whole thing as an attack on the Senate, on democracy, you know.
So even though they haven't filed charges, they're still taking it seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got people like Representative Zia Lanto Adion from Lanao do Sur, and he's calling for a full-blown investigation. He's saying this is way more than just talk.
Right. I mean, with Duterte's history, it's hard to just dismiss it, isn't it?
Exactly. Adion's basically saying, look, we can't just sit here and pretend this isn't a big deal. You know, we ignore these kinds of threats, even if they seem empty. Who knows what could happen?
So he's worried about setting a precedent, like saying it's okay to threaten violence to get what you want.
That's exactly it. And it's not just him. Representative Jay Conhun from Zambales is also speaking out against Duterte.
What's his take?
Well, he's also condemning those kill remarks, but he's going a step further and saying that this kind of talk really hurts people's trust in the government.
So he's worried about the long-term impact on democracy.
Exactly. It creates this climate of fear, you know. And that's the opposite of what a healthy democracy needs.
This is already turning into a huge mess. You've got legal battles brewing, different branches of law enforcement disagreeing, lawmakers worried. And all because of one comment.
It's a total powder keg, isn't it? It just goes to show how deep the divides run in Philippine society.
So what happens now? I mean, what are the possible consequences of all this for Duterte and for the Philippines?
Well, let's start with the legal stuff. First of all, it's not even clear if those charges against Duterte will actually stick.
So he could just get away with it.
It's possible, yeah. I mean, the Philippine legal system, let's just say it can be pretty complicated. It can be really hard to hold powerful people accountable, even when there's clear evidence.
But you're saying even if the charges are dropped, there could still be consequences.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Charges were actually filed, right? That in itself is huge.
So it shows that at least some people are willing to stand up to him.
Exactly. And that could change things, you know? It could mean that his power isn't as absolute as it used to be.
So even if he dodges this legal bullet, his image, his influence, it's taken a hit.
Yeah, definitely. And then there's the impact on Philippine society, right? I mean, whether you love him or hate him, you can't deny that this has sparked a conversation that needed to happen.
About freedom of speech, about what's acceptable in politics.
Yeah, and it's forcing people to really grapple with Duterte's legacy. What does his time in office say about the Philippines?
So even though it's messy, even though it's painful, maybe this whole controversy could actually lead to some positive changes.
I think it has that potential. Yeah, it's like a wake-up call, you know. It could be a chance for the Philippines to really recommit to democratic values and today, okay, this is what we stand for. This is how we want our leaders to behave.
I like that. A chance for growth. But couldn't it also go the other way? I mean, couldn't it divide the country even more?
That's a risk too, yeah. Duterte still has a lot of supporters, and a lot of them see this whole thing as a witch hunt. So this could actually rally them around him even more.
There's this tension, right? You want to hold people accountable, but you also don't want to create more conflict.
It's a tough balance to strike, but that's the situation the Philippines have done.
Yeah, it's a microcosm of all the challenges they're facing. The past, the present, the hopes for the future. It's all tangled up together.
Exactly. And we're only just scratching the surface here. There are so many layers to this story. And it's still unfolding, right? The consequences of all this, they could reverberate for years.
So we've talked about the immediate fallout, the legal stuff, the impact on society. But what about the big picture? How could this incident change the way politics is done in the Philippines going forward?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? One possibility is that this has a chilling effect on free speech. Politicians might get scared, you know? They might start watching every word they say, afraid of ending up in the same boat as Duterte.
So instead of promoting free speech, it ends up silencing people.
It could happen, yeah. But there's also another possibility, right? This whole thing could actually encourage more people to speak out. They might see what happened to Duterte and say, hey, we don't have to tolerate this kind of behavior anymore.
So it could actually lead to more transparency, more accountability.
It's possible, yeah. It really depends on how the public reacts. Do they demand better from their leaders, or do they just shrug it off?
This whole situation just shows you how powerful words can be, especially when they come from someone like a former president.
No doubt about it. Every word they say can have a ripple effect. It can change the entire political landscape.
This feels like a real turning point for the Philippines, you know, like a clash between the old ways and the new.
And like any turning point, it's going to be unpredictable, but we're definitely at a crossroads here, both legally and politically.
So where do we go from here? We've talked about Duterte, the charges against him, the reactions, the possible consequences. But there's another piece of this puzzle we haven't even touched on yet, and it involves Duterte's own daughter. It's almost like a family affair, right? The Dutertes always pushing the boundaries, testing the limits.
Yeah, and it makes you think, how much has really changed in the Philippines? Is this still the same old game, just with new players?
Well, speaking of the Dutertes, there's actually another twist to this whole story. Remember the NBI, the ones who were downplaying Duterte's comments? Well, they just filed charges against his own daughter, Vice President Sara Duterte.
It's like a soap opera or something.
I know, right? So what's the deal with that? Charges against the vice president.
Yeah, it seems she made some threats of her own, and not just to anyone, to President Marcos himself and some other officials.
Wow, that's ballsy, even for a Duterte. What did she say?
The details haven't been released, but it was serious enough for the NBI to take action.
So wait a minute, the NBI is going after the daughter, but they're giving the father a pass. What's going on here?
It's almost like they're saying, okay, maybe things have changed. What might have been acceptable before, it's not going to fly anymore.
It's like this double standard, right? One rule for the father, another for the daughter.
It definitely raises some eyebrows, but it also highlights how complex this whole situation is. It's not just about Duterte, it's about the entire political landscape in the Philippines.
And remember, this is all happening while people are calling for an investigation into Duterte's remarks. So what happened with that? Did the NBI actually look into it?
Well, funny you should ask that. Director Santiago, remember him? The guy who downplayed Duterte's comments. Well, he basically dismissed the whole thing.
Why?
He said no senator actually filed a complaint.
So because the senators aren't officially complaining, the NBI is just going to ignore it.
It seems that way, yeah. And it kind of makes you wonder, right? What happens when something like this happens, but no one in power is willing to step up and say, hey, this is wrong?
It's like a loophole in the system, isn't it?
Exactly. It exposes a real vulnerability.
So we've got Duterte seemingly off the hook, at least for now. His daughter's in trouble for something similar. And the whole country is grappling with these really tough questions about free speech, political power, what's acceptable, what's not. It's a lovely process.
Yeah, and I think the biggest takeaway here, the thing we keep coming back to, is that words have power. It doesn't matter if you're a former president, a vice president, whatever. What you say matters.
It's like we're watching history unfold in real time. It's a turning point, for sure.
And it's messy, it's unpredictable, but it's definitely a story that we need to pay attention to.
Well, we've gone through the whole thing, right? We talked about Duterte's comment, what it means, the reactions, the possible consequences. We even talked about his daughter. It's a lot. So now it's your turn to weigh in. What do you think about all this? Was Duterte just blowing off steam, or did he cross the line? Let us know your take. And hey, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll be back soon with more stories that matter.